present his work. After that, you will be given the opportunity to ask questions on understanding only, so if you don't understand a term or a graph, and we will be discussing all three presentations together in the last half hour of the session. Okay, I'm happy to have my colleague Jan Priewe here first, who's going to teach us or explain to us what emerging markets really are. Okay, Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. This morning in the welcome introduction, the term emerging markets was used very often. And as normal, in a welcome speech, you don't need to define. But if you take it as an economic and scientific term, we have to define it. And that is what I'm trying to do. And I tell you the result. I'm not very satisfied with this term, so my proposal is not to drop the workshop title, but to drop this term. And don't use emerging market economies longer as an academic term, because there is no convincing definition. So what I want to do is come to some definitions about the performance of countries that are classified in different forms in income groups, high-income countries, low-income countries, etc. Look at the performance of the selection of so-called emerging economies. 26 are selected. Are they developing countries? Yes or not all of them. Some are. And is there a catching up or a delinking from advanced economies in the decades or the next decade to come? And I come up with some conclusions. So, how to define? The first one using this term was Anton van Ackmayer, the former IFC manager. He founded the Emerging Markets Management, a financial corporation, and used this term in 1981. And the idea to fund a third world equity fund was legitimated with these words. This is a quote: "Racking my brain, at last I came up with a term that sounded more positive and invigorating: emerging markets. Third world suggested stagnation. Emerging market suggested progress, uplift, and dynamism." So it seems to be almost the same as developing countries, but with a nicer sound. Joshua Eisenman, now a well-known economist, wrote in the Palgrave Dictionary of Economics, countries or markets that are not well established economically and financially but are making progress in that direction. And if you read his article, he mainly speaks of the rapidly growing or newly industrialized Asian countries like Taiwan, Korea, etc. And so it is not clear what he really means. There is no clear-cut set of criteria that he proposes to use. In the financial media, the term emerging markets was used, following Ackmayer and others, as rapidly growing financial markets with high yield and higher risk than in non-emerged traditional first world markets, with a strong preference for large countries. So in principle, when we use this term emerging markets, it is the markets, the financial markets in more advanced developing countries which are not really clearly defined. Very often transition countries in Eastern Europe were added per se as being emerging market economies. So this is not financial markets, it's just transition, another term for transition economies. Later, Jim O'Neill, a Goldman Sachs manager, used instead of the emerging markets the term the BRICS. First he used BRIC, and then in 2010 China proposed to include South Africa as the gateway, or as the asserted gateway to Africa, with a population similar to India or similar to China, if you take Africa as a whole. So it became the BRICS with a capital S as the fifth country, standing for the whole African continent. But recently, Jim O'Neill has said maybe BRICS is no longer up to date. We should change that term because South Africa may not stand for Africa as a whole, and it is a heterogeneous category. So the terms are fluid. So there is no standing clearly defined terms. So if you look at different financial organizations which try to define so-called emerging markets, you come up with different lists. Some say only 7 countries belong to this group, others go up to 35 countries. So the number of countries varies, and there are no clear criteria disclosed to the public. So it is, again, there is no scientific definition using clear-cut and well-legitimized criteria. Now, the IMF does not use the emerging countries category. They just use an overall category of developing and emerging countries without any differentiation. So it seems that it is one pot, and you can interpret this way that emerging economies are developing countries as well. The World Bank does not use this term at all. The World Bank classifies countries along income per capita. UNDP uses, as you all know, the Human Development Indicator, does not use emerging countries. And so obviously it is a necessity to differentiate among, say, 170 or so, or 180 developing countries. So we need some kind of term, but we don't have it. So there's a lot of hype of emerging. Many in the media and from financial markets believe that sooner or later the so-called emerging markets are to predominate the old economies, the OECD countries, in 10 or 20 years, especially China, India, and some others, when they have more than 50% world GDP. But these are forecasts and based on not really scientific or academically sound forecast methods. Methodology is not really disclosed to the public. Now, what I want to do is first to get an overview on countries as classified by the World Bank in income groups. You may know the present thresholds: low income countries less than roughly 1,000 US dollar per capita per annum, lower middle income countries, you see it on the screen, and high income countries above 12,000 something. So the performance, if you look at the numbers, differs strongly if you use PPP dollars or constant US dollars. Normally, if you count in PPP and purchasing power parity exchange rates, or artificial exchange rates, so to speak, the volume of GDP, the magnitude of GDP, is much bigger compared to using constant US dollars. So also growth rates differ according to this method, and strong differences show up if you use per capita data and just GDP data as such. So per capita growth is much lower normally than GDP growth because of population growth. So now I'll give you an overview. In the above graph, you see the numbers in PPP. The blue are the high income countries over the 2 decades, 1990 until 2010. And red and below are the other groups. The low-income countries are there, but not visible because they are less than 1%. So at least I cannot, without a look, recognize them. But you can easily see that the red and the green category have increased in the second decade of the two. Not so much, or hardly at all, in the first decade. And you see this more clearly later on. If you use the category constant US dollars, you see the overwhelming magnitude and share in global GDP of the high income countries. So world capitalism is driven formally and now, and probably in the near future as well, by the blue category, that is by the high income countries. So only, say, a quarter or less than a quarter of global GDP in constant $2,000 is from developing countries. If you take everything below high income category as developing countries. just if you roughly compare world GDP in PPP and world GDP in constant dollars, look at the last two bars on the right hand side here. So world GDP is roughly 20% or so higher if you count in PPP compared to constant dollars. And this is even more true if you look at developing countries, where the difference between the two methods of counting is much stronger. So in the low income category, you can see this is low. Middle income countries, you can see the difference if you count in purchasing power parity. The reason why PPP gives us a higher magnitude of GDP is simply that we have a strong non-tradable sector. The poorer the countries are, the less developed they are. So the official exchange rate does not make sense, or not always make sense to use it. And this has to do with dualism in the economies. And this, on the other hand, has to do with a big subsistence sector where there is no money, or very few markets only. So more developed countries have less difference or no difference at all between PPP and constant dollars method. If you look at growth rates, now in constant US dollars, just a rough overview shows us that in this 20 years period, which is quite heterogeneous, the 1990s were totally different from the last decade, I will come to that, the BRICS grew by 5%, strongly driven by China and to a lesser extent by India, not so much driven, Andre, by South Africa. The upper middle income countries grew by 3.9%. Here again, China is one of the driving forces. Low income countries grew in per capita. So low-income countries grew only by 1.7%, so the last decade for low-income countries, and OECD countries grew by 1.3%. So sub-Saharan developing Africa 0.9% per capita. Now here I listed 152 countries for which I found the data. You cannot read them, at least I can't. And here you have the high-income countries, upper middle-income, low-income countries. And you see the blue line is the GDP and per capita in current US dollars. And the other line is in PPP. And you see the difference. The difference is bigger, the poorer the countries are. And for the high-income countries, you have some countries like Qatar, for instance, here, where the GDP in PPP is higher than in official exchange rates. So these are outliers, I would say. You can clearly see the United States is here in the high-income group, and here the margin for high-income countries is 12,000. It is about Portugal. Portugal is a little bit above. Russian Federation is the upper group of the upper middle income countries. China is on the margin. In some cases, I put it in the upper middle income group in the year 2010. Here I took the numbers of 2009, so it was still below. The lower middle income countries were rising. So China is in GDP per capita as the level on the lower side in the world economy, and India is just in the lower middle income group, just upgraded or graduated from the low income group recently. Now, this is one of my, I think, most interesting, for me at least, most interesting graphs. I wanted to see whether or not there is catching up with the OECD core group of 31 countries. So I took the income per capita in PPP and in constant US dollars and compared the different income groups with the OECD average. And now count it in constant US dollars, and you see the ratio of the upper middle income countries to OECD. For the 1990s, there was a little bit of catching up, not much, but in the last decade, it was roaring upwards. So there was a strong mushrooming catching up tendency in this group, strongly driven by China, which is now counted in this group. In the green line are the lower middle income countries. You see hardly any movement in the 90s, but some movement in the catching up in the last decade. And the low income group is almost delinked, or I should say stagnant on the low level. But look at the numbers. So not yet 12% of the OECD level in the upper middle income countries. So they are far away. They have not emerged. They are emerging or have emerged in that decade, but continues on. In PPP, the level is different, and the increase in the last decade is not that strong as counted in constant dollars. And this is unweighted. So I did take China as a country like many others. It counts as one country among many, and so because this is strongly determined by or driven by China and by India, these huge economies, and this is now in PPP, but weighted. So we can see a similar picture, but not as pronounced as the one in constant US dollars. So there is some catching up, especially in the upper middle income group in the last decade, but the big question is whether this will continue in the next decade. Now, here you see it more precisely. I put all developing countries together, all middle income groups and low income groups, and compared it with the high income countries here. High income countries grew in the last decade only by 0.9%, and in the 1990s by 2%. This is per capita always. So high-income countries fell down, and developing countries, all of the others below the high-income countries, grew strongly. Why did they grow? Because of China, because of India, because of the BRICS, because of commodity prices, because of oil. So this is the situation we have. Now I try to identify some emerging economies following different lists from different institutions. And I took those countries, which are not very small, so I excluded countries with less than 1 million citizens, and I took those countries which are mentioned by two financial institutions like Dow Jones or others, or Goldman Sachs or so, which were called emerging economies, and came up with this list. And you see at a glance that this list comprises countries which are extremely different, from Israel with 28,000 current US dollars per capita in 2010, and Bangladesh with 674. Both are on the same boat as so-called emerging economies, many individually. So it is a mix of high-income countries, some high-income countries, and even low-income countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh and India just above the margin. They comprise 5 African or Middle East countries, 10 Asian countries, 6 Latin American, and 7 from Europe, the former traditional countries. Even Korea was in that boat. So some facts about those 26 so-called countries. 4.3 billion people live there. Average income 4,000 some hundred current US dollars. So very much below the advanced countries. There are 2 low-income countries, among them 6 lower middle-income countries. The majority is from the upper middle-income countries, and 4 high-income countries are included as well. 8 OECD members are in this emerging country group. That is Chile, Czech Republic, Hungary, Israel, Korea, Mexico, Poland, and Turkey. Some of them are listed by OECD as typical developing countries, others are not listed. So, oil-producing countries I excluded because it is a category in itself. And then I looked at the data for Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, so the Asian rapidly growing economies. They all have similar GDP per capita compared to Korea, and I think they should be called emerged economies. It makes no sense to call them emerging, so there, look at Singapore with a GDP per capita of 41,000, that is about the United States. So they are like OECD countries, and only Korea is an OECD country. Are the so-called emerging countries high growth countries? No, they are not. Some are growing quickly, like the BRICS, and some others. Some have low growth. So having emerged at a fairly high level of GDP, like Israel or Czech Republic or Hungary, does not necessarily mean that they are growing rapidly. And rapid growth would be really a precondition for further emerging and catching up with richer countries. So the blue line is the growth rates. Only 4 of these 26 countries are really high growth countries, and these are mainly headed by China, India, and Korea. If you look at the list of countries which are high growth economies in the world, only 13 among those 41 rapidly growing countries are from emerging economies. So speaking of emerging economies does not necessarily mean they have above average growth in the world economy. Now I skip a few countries. Look at the BRIC countries. Red is China. 2/3 of GDP are, well, 2/3 of the increase in global GDP from the BRICS is from China. And the rest is mainly from Brazil and India. Russia and South Africa is not so remarkable. Now, my question is, are the so-called emerging economies developing countries? Well, I will now use Korea as a benchmark. I argue, without much explanation, at least not now, that Korea is a developed country, and in red the data apply to Korea. So Korea in many aspects, especially using 9 criteria, which you see now, these other countries are mostly, not all, developing countries. I use GDP per capita leveled in current US dollar of the year 2009. I use GDP growth in order to say that if you have high growth, it is likely that you sooner or later will reach the developed countries' status, education, life expectancy at birth, research and development expenditure, low absolute poverty, below $2 a day, low share of agriculture in the labor force, high value added in industry relative to GDP, and credit to GDP to show the development of the financial markets. And here you see, using the 9 criteria and the red line as Korea benchmark, we can see the 25 emerging economies without Korea. They range on all counts way below Korea, especially in research and development, but also in GDP per capita level, so way below 50% of Korea's level, which is 100, but also in all the others. However, this is not true for all single 26 countries. Red here is, for instance, China. China is in per capita GDP growth extraordinary, but in the level of GDP fairly low compared to Korea, and also in research it is low, and so it is with the other countries. If you take India, India is very, very small, so it is so far away from Korea. Here I took some other countries like Argentina, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, and Turkey, compared them with Korea, because these 4 countries, they are the ones close to the BRICS. So they are the next BRICS, if you want to say, and they make up a high share of GDP of the so-called emerging countries. But still, they are, in some indicators, quite far away from Korea. So, which of the 26 so-called EMEs can be called developed? I would say it is Korea, Israel, Czech Republic. They did emerge, so they should be called developed countries. By all accounts, you don't find criteria where you cannot call them developed. Hungary, Poland, and Chile are at the margin. But the other 20 from the 26 sample, they are for sure developing countries, with all the 9 criteria that are used. Interestingly, if you look at the criterion for industrialization as a share of GDP, all emerging economies have arrived at full industrialization. Their degree of industrialization is higher than in OECD, so they should be called industrialized countries. And the OECD countries are no longer properly classified as industrialized countries. Their share of industry is falling, with the exception of Germany. The technological potential of all EMEs is way below OECD and way below Korea. However, these 20 countries are very diverse, and to put them in one boat is questionable. They are in different classes, in different football leagues, so to speak. Now I have to skip a few points. My baseline is the category EME is, from a developmental point of view, not very sensible. The group is too heterogeneous. Even from a purely financial point of view, there are no clear-cut criteria to put them in one group. Whatever classification you take, it does not make sense. Nevertheless, there is the hype to call them this way because we don't have another term. I would say we should call them developing countries. Brazil is a developing country. China is a typical developing country. Rapidly growing, yes, but in many counts they are like normal developing countries. Now, can we expect that in the next decade there will be further catching up or even delinking or desynchronization from developed OECD 31 countries? Well, many people think so. And I think this will not, it is very unlikely. What is for sure is that the OECD country group will have less growth than in the last decade because of the aftermath of the financial crisis and many other problems. So we can say, with the wisdom of hindsight, that the last decade was an exceptional decade in world economic history, after the 80s and 90s as lost decades for most developing countries. Now, the last decade was predominantly determined by commodity price rises, oil and all the other commodities. And it is unlikely that that speed will continue in the next years. And of course, this decade was strongly driven by China. So whether or not emerging economies further catch up depends a lot on China. Their growth was strongly driven by export-oriented growth. And this export-oriented growth, especially in China, was, of course, strongly dependent on growth in the United States and in Europe, mainly in the United States. But this will not continue in the next decade for sure, that the United States will grow as it did in the 1990s. And when we talk about globalization, it means financial integration. So it also means economic and trade integration, so it is very unlikely that desynchronization of the business cycles and desynchronization of growth patterns will happen in the next few decades, unless these emerging countries, in particular China, will turn quickly to domestic demand-driven growth. That means consumption-driven growth, driven by higher incomes, mainly by higher wages. Unlikely, I would say, that this happens. China is trying to do this, but still they depend a lot. some authors say that 1/3 of China's growth in the 90s was driven by net exports and their direct and indirect effects. And my conjecture is that China will have lower growth in the future, and many determinants of Chinese high growth in the past 2 decades or 3 decades even will fade away, so China's growth will not come down to say, Indian growth or to Indonesia's growth or to German growth, but it will not be as exceptional as it was in the past. So, this is a baseline or a bottom line, I should say, for all rapidly growing emerging economies, that they would have to turn to another pattern of growth, which is more determined by domestic demand growth and less determined by export-led growth, unless they will not be able to de-link, at least de-link somewhat, from lower growth in the advanced countries, and secondly, there will have to be more south-south growth in order to de-link and desynchronize from the growth of the advanced OECD countries. So, these are my conclusions. The E&E category should be dropped, at least as an academic term. So-called E&Es are too heterogeneous. Performance of middle-income countries is totally mixed. Some middle-income countries have now become strong industrialized countries, or most have become strong industrialized countries, still a strong backlog in research and development and in education and in the financial sector. No sign of general catching up of all E&Es. We should not generalize the last decade. There is no automatic escalator from emerging to emerged, and the majority of E&Es are still typical developing countries. Even the BRICS are an extremely heterogeneous category, and the term hides huge structural disparities, say, between Russia and China or India and South Africa. Middle-income countries must avoid to get stuck in development traps, and the hype of emergence obfuscates the true developmental obstacles that we have in so many developing countries. I took, I think, 1 minute more, so
very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, do we have any technical questions to the answer presentation? If that's not the case, I would like to move on to our next presenter, which I think is Joerg Mayer. And again, 30 minutes maximum. Of course, yours as soon as young start.
Globalization and national income inequality, recent experience in emerging economies. So I would like to talk about the distribution of income within the emerging economy. So it is not what Jan was talking about, the catching up process, which would be inequality between the countries, but it's national inequality. So you might also want to think about this title as globalization and the inclusiveness of economic growth. Now, to start with, it may be interesting to reflect a moment about the question, why is globalization, national income distribution an issue at all? And I think it's fair to observe that there has been a concern across the world about the inclusiveness of growth in this globalization era. So if you think about the headlines, there are certainly the spring, I think, was related to the issues. But especially in the developed world, one thinks a lot about in the United States about the Occupy Wall Street movements and so on. So this is very much an issue of the distribution at the top level. And this is not what I would like to talk about, but it's much more a broader phenomenon. I think this top level issue is more of a phenomenon in the advanced economies. it's not so much present in the developed world or in the emerging economies, if you like. And I think it's an issue, the distributional issue. It is important because, first of all, it influences attitudes of society at large about globalization. If society feels that there are more losers than winners from globalization, there may be a backlash. And they may think about winning or losing not so much in terms of absolute levels of income, but more the relative level. So if you see your neighbor is becoming rich and you aren't, you will think, well, something's wrong. So if there is an issue about globalization and the distribution of income, it may well change the attitude of society with respect to globalization and therefore lead to a backlash, which would be bad, I would say, because globalization certainly brings benefits to economies. But independently of that, there's also, it's important to understand how globalization influences the distribution of incomes for the policymakers. For the policymakers, in order to do something about maximizing the benefits of globalization or to counter the adverse effects. So, just this first slide to set the stage. I would like to talk about, first of all, the recent evolution of income distribution in emerging economies, and you'll see that since we don't know who precisely is part of the emerging economy, we would like to take a broader view and at the same time a narrower, focusing on specific economies. Then provide some explanations about the divergences, and as reason, is it just the policies, or is it just the globalization forces, or is it both? And is there some sort of dependence? And then, in more detail, some explanations about China, the emerging economies in Latin America, and the transition economies. So, let me start now with the recent evolution of income distribution since the 1980s. Here, if you take a broader view, if you like, about emerging economies, and you think of them in a way as the developing and the transition economies, what first is striking here is the level. That the level of inequality is very different. And that was especially true in the 1980s. It's changed now. The levels have become more similar. At the same time, what you see is a very strong change in the evolution of income distribution in the transition economies during the 1990s, or the first part of the 1990s especially. But then, what is also interesting, it's kind of a dichotomy, that you have developing America and Africa, where the distribution of income has become more equal, where you have developing Asia and the transition economies, where it has become less equal. Now, what is here for Africa, the line stops in 2005, which is for reasons of data availability, or rather non-availability. But the line for if you do estimates, it's like this, so it falls. It continued to decline. Now, thinking about Asia, there's of course this notion about the Asian success stories, which is a story of growth with equity, and this shows precisely the opposite, though. Why is that? It's because these averages are weighted by population. So China and India plays a very important role here. And in fact, if you move to country-specific evidence, so at first I think this chart looks a bit messy, but I think it isn't. I've tried to make it less messy. And in fact, you can see that the divergence or the dichotomy is present even at the level of individual economies. You have the greenish lines are those for Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. And for all three, you have a move towards more equal distribution. You have the reddish lines, China for Asia, China, and India, where you have an upward movement, and the Korean experience, in fact, does show this notion of growth with equity for the period between 1980 and 1995, and then slightly moved up with the Asian crisis, and it's been relatively stable. What you also see is mirroring the curve for the transition economy. Here, the Russian Federation, this enormous increase in inequality, a slight fall, and then again an increase. And for Africa, I have South Africa, where you also have quite an important shift, but also a movement towards more equal distribution over the past 5 years or so. So the question, of course, is, if you have such a dichotomy and such a divergence, how can you explain that? And I already mentioned, is there an explanation for each economy? I mean, if you speak about China, you would of course say, well, Chinese experience is very exceptional, but speak about Brazil or Argentina or whatever, there's always an exception. There are always specific factors which are true only for specific economies. So the first hypothesis is that all emerging economies face the same global economic factors, so that it is obvious that if there's a different development for the countries, it has obviously to do with differences in the domestic policies. This is one explanation. So in a way, you would argue there's no point in thinking about globalization in the first place. But in a way, the precise opposite would be that there are structural explanations, and that it is in fact the level of industrialization and the resource endowment of a country that determines how these equal external forces affect the conditions in the countries. And especially if these effects spur industrialization, or rather, if they cause de-industrialization. But the argument I would want to make is very much along the lines of the second hypothesis, but at the same time, I argue that policies that are adopted also to play a role. It's very much the policies that affect industrialization. Now, the question, of course, is why is industrialization so important in this context of income distribution? It is because of this issue of structural change, and that during the process of structural change, there are certain effects on the distribution of income. Now, structural change means that the process of economic development is structural change from agriculture over industries to services. And that during this process, there's a change in the distribution of income, and there's the hypothesis that the distribution of income moves like an inverted U-shape, which means that it goes up first, and the distribution of income becomes less equal first, and then it becomes more equal. And that this process and the changes along the curve are governed by the size of the manufacturing sectors. So it very much depends on the sector-specific proportions. So the main factor are the sector-specific proportions and the sector and the specific size of the manufacturing sector. But the impact it will have on each individual economy also depends on two additional factors. The first one is the difference in the average income of each of these sectors. So how is the proportion in the income between agriculture and manufacturing and services? And the second additional factor, how is the distribution within each of these sectors? So you could incomes between the sectors and the distribution of income within this sector. So it's quite a complex picture. And in fact, the distributional effects of globalization depend very much on how they affect the structural change, and especially the creation of employment and wage opportunities in the manufacturing sector. But also, as I mentioned for the previous slide, it is not just these structural factors, but it's also how these structural factors, how these effects from globalization are reinforced or attenuated through domestic policies. Now, of course, employment and wage opportunities should be in high productivity sectors, such that you can have rising income. I mean, what you want is a relatively equal distribution of income at high levels. You don't want to be everybody poor. So the employment and wage opportunities in high productivity sectors is very important. And if you look at the evidence for different geographical regions over the past few years, you in fact see quite a difference. So this graph is from Macmillan and Roderick, that you saw that structural change in Asia between 1990 and 2005 was very much from low productivity sectors into high productivity sectors, whereas for Africa, Latin America, and I would suppose for West Asia also, it was the opposite. I mean, in a way, it's an issue of industrialization and de-industrialization. So now to move to individual countries, let me first say something about China, because I think in China this structural change effect is most obvious. And my argument is that the distribution of income, or the change in the distribution of income in China, has very much been driven by spatial inequality. It is very much an issue of an emerging gap between rural areas and urban areas, And it's very much an issue of even urban areas in the interior of the country or the urban areas on the coast. And that in fact these factors, so these spatial inequality factors, explain more than half of national income inequality. Now this gap, especially interior regions to the coast, has been strongly influenced by the development strategy of China, which has relied to a large extent on FDI. So FDI has played an important role in industrial development and the creation of employment, and therefore in the distributional process through this gap between interior and coast. What has also played a role in China is the change in the ownership structure of industry in the 1990s, and which is interesting, I think, in China, is that wages in the state-owned enterprise still exceed those in the private sector, which is in fact the opposite of what you observe, for example, in the Russian Federation. So this change in ownership structure and the differences in wage levels between the state-owned enterprise and the private sector play an important role. Now, just to compare this issue about spatial inequality in China with the evidence for countries in Asia, you see, as I said, that it's more than half of overall inequality for China. That spatial inequality is also quite important in China, in India, and it has also some importance in Indonesia. So, I mean, we all know that the Chinese authorities have recognized this, and there's the attempt to move to a harmonious society and to do away with these inequalities. Now, there are through the adoption of minimum wages, for example, there's a contract now, new contract law for labor, which also includes the migrant workers and so on. So the Chinese authorities are addressing this issue. Now, I mentioned the impact of FDI, and FDI has played an important role for manufacturing employment, but its impact on the distribution of income is quite mixed. What you see in this graph is that on the vertical axis you have the percentage change in the stock of FDI, and you have that FDI outflows from advanced economies, which are the blue dots, and FDI inflows in low-wage economies, or if you like, in emerging economies, which are the pink dots. So if you think we have here the FDI, and if we have here employment in manufacturing, you see in a way that FDI flows have been associated with a movement, if you like, of employment from the advanced economies to the low-wage economies. The exceptions are especially in Eastern Europe. However, this is of course a partial impression, because FDI of course is not only in manufacturing, and it's not only greenfield FDI, but FDI may be mergers and acquisitions, or FDI may be in the primary sector or in the services sector. And this may explain why, if you look at FDI and the change in the distribution of income based on the Gini coefficient, the picture is much more mixed. That you don't have the advanced economies on one side and the low-wage economies on the other side, but it's very mixed. However, if you draw a trend line through the observations of low-wage economies, you can see that it's upward sloping, and that's true even if you exclude the outliers. So in a way, it indicates that more FDR inflows are associated with more inequality, and it is in fact a result that we find in econometric exercise. For example, in the OECD studies, Divided We Stand, they also find this, that FDR inflows have a negative impact on the distribution of income. Now, moving from China to Latin America, my argument is that income distribution in emerging economies in Latin America has been driven very much by movements in the terms of trade and policies that were adopted, which means that the competition from China is not the main reason for deindustrialization or for because in fact deindustrialization in Latin America occurred prior to China's entry. Rather, it is trade and financial liberalization and macroeconomic austerity that was adopted in Latin America, which is behind this phenomenon of deindustrialization. However, more recently, there has been an improvement in the terms of trade, and the argument is that the improvement of terms of trade has allowed Latin American policymakers to adopt policies that has helped moving to a more equal distribution of income. For example, the introduction or the increases in the minimum wage, expansion of public employment, and also of investment in social expenditure. Now, to substantiate the argument about the terms of trade, I have here plotted changes in the terms of trade against changes in the distribution of income. And what's quite interesting to observe that the countries up here which have experienced an improvement in the terms of trade and moved to more equal distribution of income are from Latin America. So it's not all countries from developing America. We have some small countries for which it's not true, but here it is quite a special feature for Latin America to have used the terms of trade improvement for improved distribution of income. And you see that this is not true for Africa. I only have 3 observations: South Africa and Ghana, which also experienced an improvement in terms of trade, but income inequality has worsened, and in a way opposite Mauritius, where income distribution has become much more equal, but they experience a decline in the terms of trade. Now, I have to just speed up, so only a few words about the transition economies, where the argument is that it's driven very much by privatization or change in ownership structure and by financial globalization or by financial integration. As I already mentioned, the distribution of wages in the Russian Federation is the opposite of that in China, which is here in Russia that wages in the public sector are much lower than those in the private sector. Now, financial integration has played a very strong role because it has led to the indebtedness of private households and private enterprises, which, when the tide turns and there's a sudden stop to financial inflows, they experience over indebtedness. So it is a very adverse effect on the distribution of income. Now, more recently, the financial integration, the composition of financial inflows has changed. It is no longer an issue really of debt, but it's much more an issue of portfolio flows into the stock market. And you see here the indebtedness of private firms, which increased enormously in emerging Europe and Central Asia between 1990 and 2006, and especially in the Russian Federation. There, it was very much due to bank loans. And you see this change here in the composition of the liability side of financial inflows. The solid lines are for emerging economies more generally. The dotted lines are for the Russian Federation. So you can see the decline in the share of debt and the increase of FDI and of portfolio investment. And what is very striking is that for the Russian Federation, portfolio investment has become has assumed a much larger share than emerging economies on averages. To conclude, there's no single observation, no single explanation for changes in the distribution of income in emerging economies, in the sense that if you want to do an econometric exercise, you will be obliged to plug in dummy variables. For some of the countries or for some of the independent variables. And the argument was that globalization affects distribution of income through its impact on structural change, and especially through its impact on employment and wage opportunities in the manufacturing sector. But that it's not only the structure of the globalization factors, but that policies can strengthen or attenuate these effects, and that, however, which is not really in the presentation here, but such policies are much more effective if they influence market outcomes rather than trying to redistribute afterwards their outcome through taxation, through transfers, and so on. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much. And all of that and much more is in the Trade and Development report, which will be released in September. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joerg. And for all the partners, usually we get the Trade and Development report from UNCTAD as part of the big package of UNCTAD publications sometimes in the second half of the year. So we'll all have the opportunity to read them. Okay.